All right, welcome to today's Explainer. Today we are stepping way off the beaten path, leaving the mundane behind and diving headfirst into a deeply dark, psychological myth. Honestly, going through this source material, I feel like a weary chronicler, just painstakingly documenting the terrifying, inevitable collapse of logic itself. We're going to be unpacking the legend of the Crimson Doctor and exploring this profound, incredibly unsettling concept called the architecture of disillusion.
Just let this quote sink in for a second. The raw, unlegislated chaos of the subconscious. It's a seriously haunting thought, isn't it? Because that is exactly what we're dealing with today. We aren't talking about, a simple monster hiding under the bed. We are talking about a world on the absolute brink of total dissolution. A reality where the very walls of our own minds are threatening to cave in. This text takes us deep into the fabric of our carefully curated realities and shows us exactly what happens when that fabric starts to tear.
Okay, let's jump right into Section 1, the Fragile Iron Kingdom. So, to really understand this coming threat, we first have to understand the world it's invading. It's this rigid, incredibly heavy place built specifically to keep the void out. And the ruler of this kingdom? The text calls him the Traveler, or the Last Man. Now, this guy is basically the ultimate symbol of the human ego. He's trying to hide from reality behind all this opulent masonry and immense wealth, locking himself inside these literal, gilded cages of his own making. He surrounds himself with unearned majesty, totally convinced that as long as his physical iron walls are sound, his internal reality is safe. He's just desperate for silence and control.
But here is where we hit a terrifying contrast. The Traveler's world is entirely built out of heavy masonry and strict, rigid laws. It's an architecture of stasis. It relies on having a solid shape. But the coming threat, the Crimson Doctor, he possesses absolutely no solid shape whatsoever. He operates with this fluid lightness. It's such a beautiful but horrifying juxtaposition. I mean, how do you fight something that refuses to take a solid form? How is a rigid iron wall supposed to stop a rising tide?
Which brings us to Section 2, Arrival of the Sentinel.
When the inevitable finally happens, those heavy iron gates of the kingdom? Totally useless. The Doctor simply melts right through the opulent stone. He moves with that fluid lightness, literally treating solid iron as if it were just morning mist. So who exactly is this invader? I'm going to read this clinical classification straight from our source, the dossier of the liquid rupture. Entity specimen, the cosmic-eyed. He is the physical manifestation of the subconscious and the spirit of negation. It almost feels like reading a forbidden medical file, right? It perfectly bridges the gap between a mythological monster and an absolute psychological inevitability. He's not just a physical bad guy. He is the embodiment of the raw, unlegislated chaos of our subconscious mind, pushing back against the conscious ego.
The text characterizes him as the final sentinel. And his overarching role isn't just mindless random destruction. No, he's actually the ultimate guardian of psychological truth. And his specific job is to enforce the collapse of rigid mental structures. When the ego builds its walls way too high, when it strays way too far from reality, the final sentinel shows up to correct the imbalance.
Moving on to Section 3, the ego's blood tax.
You see, the Crimson Doctor arrives to demand a seriously painful toll from anyone who hides behind unearned majesty. His very presence acts like a corrosive acid. The source material describes him beautifully and terribly as a jagged blade that slices through curated illusions. Just picture the Traveler, sitting there in the absolute dead silence of his carefully constructed artificial world, and then the Doctor arrives and just tears that silence apart. He slices right through every single lie the ego tells itself to feel safe.
Now, it is absolutely crucial to understand what this blood tax actually is. It essentially forces the ego into a terrifying, completely unavoidable confrontation with its deepest trauma. The text calls this the original catastrophe. And you cannot just pay him off with the wealth of your gilded cages. No way. The tax is entirely psychological. It is the agonizing process of finally facing the very void you built your massive Iron Kingdom to avoid in the first place.
Let's look at Section 4, the Surreal Playhouse.
As the Doctor moves deeper into the kingdom, we get this incredible chronological mapping of the physical and logical world breaking down. Imagine the Traveler's 7 chambers transforming one by one. At first, in Step 1, you have the opulent stone. It's rigid, proud, supposedly eternal. But as the Doctor passes through, we hit Step 2. Meaningful order just begins to dissolve. The architecture completely loses its purpose. By step 3, traditional logic is suffering a slow, very colorful death. Up isn't up anymore, solid isn't solid. And finally, step 4. These grand structural masterpieces, the ultimate symbols of the traveler's control, are warped entirely into absurd, surreal playhouses. The heavy masonry is just twisted into a mocking, dreamlike chaos.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 5, the alchemy of insignificance.
So, how exactly does this total dissolution of order happen? It's through a process the text calls the alchemy of insignificance. Let's break down its final transmutation, known as the Rubedo stage. This is literally where the old world's illusions are burned away into truth. The Doctor's arrival kicks off this stage. He takes all the visual splendor of the Traveler's kingdom, all that wealth, all that impressive masonry, and he just transforms it into ash. He systematically strips away the salve of illusion that was keeping the ego comfortably numb. And what does he give back in return? He provides the soul with the honest currency of shattered expectations.
Think about that visceral phrase for a second. The honest currency of shattered expectations. It really reveals that the Crimson Doctor's destruction, as terrifying as it is actually a purifying transaction. Those illusions, they were a fake currency. The shattered expectations, the painful realization of actual reality, is honest. It is literally the only real thing the ego has left once those iron walls finally come down.
And that brings us to our final part, Section 6, the spirit of becoming.
So why does the final sentinel do all of this? What's the point of this massive disillusion? Well, the ultimate truth the Crimson Doctor reveals is staggering. The Traveler's rigid control, the heavy masonry, the unearned majesty, the Iron Kingdom, it was all just a mask. Beneath it all was nothing but a deep, hollow fear of the void. The stasis wasn't strength, it was cowardice. It was just a desperate attempt to stop time and prevent change, because change is terrifying.
But by dismantling that Iron Kingdom, the Doctor achieves something absolutely vital. He turns that sterile stone back into the dark, fertile ground of reality. The text makes it clear that this dissolution ensures the spirit of becoming never stops moving and growing. Stasis is death, right? The raw, unlegislated chaos of the subconscious is actually necessary. It has to break up the hard, dead soil of the ego so that new, authentic life can actually have a chance to grow.
At the end of the day, we all build our own Iron Kingdoms. We all curate our little illusions to keep the void at bay. But the spirit of negation comes for all rigid structures eventually. So I want to leave you with this. When the final sentinel arrives at your gates, treating your iron walls like mist, will he find a mind already engaged in the spirit of becoming, cultivating fertile ground, or will he just find a deep, hollow fear hiding behind a gilded cage? Really makes you think. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I'll see you next time as we dive into another fascinating topic.